Today I'm going to look at a progression of philosophical ideas from the German philosopher Kant through to Hegel. Both are German philosophers, in fact. And the reason I'm talking about them is because they form the backdrop of both postmodernism and critical theory. And I said in the previous video on Hegel and Nietzsche, where I was discussing Alchemy, that Schopenhauer, the break between Schopenhauer and Hegel, I believe to be one of the most fundamental distinctions in modern philosophy. Because if we look at early modern philosophy from Descartes through to Kant, it's all English and French, largely. I mean, there's Spinoza too. English, French, British French, sorry. And then Kant comes along, and after Kant, philosophy is essentially a German endeavor. It's really the Germans that moved philosophy beyond. But basically, they took charge of philosophy. There wasn't as much innovation that happened in philosophy in France and England, except for John Stuart Mill and those sorts of things. But in terms of metaphysics, epistemology, the most fundamental philosophy that was happening in Germany. So I'm going to look at Kant to Hegel, because that Kant is the end, you could say. He's a synthesis of the tradition of modern philosophy, starting with Descartes. And on one end it goes to the rationalists, on the other end, so that's Spinoza, Leibniz, and on the other end it goes to Locke, Berkeley, Hume, the empiricists. And those two, Kant came along and tried to synthesize them and give a perfect system that would encapsulate the understanding of knowledge, metaphysics, give a full, complete philosophy that would account for all important aspects of life. And Hegel also attempted to do that, and Hegel is also considered to be the last great systematizer. Kant had a system, Spinoza had a system, and after Hegel, people sort of became more atomistic in their philosophies. So, yeah, the relevance is that it's the backdrop of postmodernism and critical theory, and that between Hegel and Schopenhauer, we have the roots of virtually all modern philosophy. You see that Schopenhauer was Nietzsche's forerunner. The person from whom that Nietzsche considered himself to have learnt the most was Schopenhauer. And Nietzsche gives a good description of the relationship between Hegel and Schopenhauer. He says they both ran to opposite ends of the German soul. And since, as I say, beginning with Kant, philosophy has been a German endeavor, you can see how this divide between Schopenhauer and Hegel is relevant to us in the modern world. As I say, they are the backdrop of postmodernism and also critical theory. So I'm going to start with a little description of postmodernism and critical theory, just to say how the thing that I'm trying to explicate. I'm trying to give a background to postmodernism and critical theory, so I'm going to start off by saying a little description of what it is. So first of all, we have this thing called the Frankfurt School. So this is the critical theory school, and they were a group of neo-Marxists. They had read Marx, they'd looked at the Marxian philosophy, and they liked the idea. They certainly were interested in a revolution, but they saw that there wasn't a way to. But they saw a couple of failings with Marx. The first one, and this is very widely recognized in Marx, is that Marx predicted that industrialized nations would automatically by themselves overthrow the oppressors. That eventually the regular man, the working class, would get fed up with the fact that they are being controlled by a small elite, and that there was really no reason for them, because they're so much greater in number, to continue to follow the rules of that elite. So it's inherent in Marx, at least in his central doctrines, that the proletariat would overthrow the elite. Frankfurt School saw that wasn't going to happen, and I think they borrow a little bit from Lenin. So one of the things that Lenin talks about essentially is that when you think about instituting a communist system, you have to realize that what it means is that you can't own private property. And if you want to institute that system you want to change the system from people having their private property to having a second system where they don't, there's always going to be, even in the most intensely ideological environment, there's always going to be holdouts who want to continue to have their property. So there has to be some form of mediation, because not everyone is going to give up their property to become a communist, to join into the utopia, which means that there has to be a mediatory principle, which for Lenin was the state. He thought that the state would come in, essentially rip the private property out of the hands of the unwilling, organize the system from the top down so that it would run by itself, presuming that technology would be sufficient, the industrialized technology would be sufficient to create an excess of goods, and then dissolve the state and everything would run itself perfectly. So that didn't. So we have the initial prediction from Marx, which failed, and then we have this situation where we have to use the state as a mediation between the oppressive system and the utopia. Seeing Marx's failure to predict kind of concerned the Frankfurt School philosophers, and they had that sympathy for Lenin where he thinks that the state had to come in. So I think the backdrop of the Frankfurt School is that they essentially believe that educated people, there needs to be a certain class of people who understand the doctrines correctly, and those people can be instantiated into power, and they will be able to organize society from the top down, and because they have their special knowledge, it will function perfectly, and then once everything's perfectly functioning, they'll just dissolve the state. But of course, it's important to recognize here that they were going to be the directors of the state. So that's the Frankfurt School. We'll move on to the Postmodernists, who also, many of them were Marxists or neo-Marxists. For instance, Foucault described himself as a Maoist. Sartre, who's not a postmodernist, but he's an existentialist, and had some, I suppose you could say, postmodern leanings. There's clearly a relationship between the existentialists and the postmodernists. The way I'd say that distinction is essentially in a basic form is just that the existentialists, Sartre at least, believed that existence precedes essence. All of our ideas about the world are secondary, and immediate experience is the ultimate reality. Whereas the postmodernists, I think, kind of theorized too much on that theme and got away from the experience of the existentialists, which was the weirdness of individual immediate experience. Both the Frankfurt School and the postmodernists use deconstruction as their main tool. So we have deconstruction in the Derridean sense, where there's information implied in each of our sentences, and in some of Derrida's most deconstructive works, he would essentially create a sentence and then try and dig up these assumptions in that sentence and then deconstruct those assumptions and then repeat that deconstructive process on the resulting sentence. And he'll just do that over and over and over and over until he gets to this book, which to some is filled with incredible recursive insights and to others is mere gobbledygook. But at the end of this little intro into postmodernism and critical theory, I'll just say that Marx was a Hegelian with a twist. He was still a utopian in the same way that Hegel was a utopian, but Marx tried to change the operative factor from ideas or spirit, Geist, and that's what the term Hegel used, to the economic conditions. Okay, so now that we've looked at that, I'm going to just describe Kant and his background. So to begin describing Kant, I think it's important to look to the beginning of the modern philosophical tradition, which begins with Descartes. Descartes' main contribution was the distinction between mind and body. So he began his philosophy trying to look for a principle upon which he could build an entirely certain set of ideas. It was essentially a scientific or mathematical approach to knowledge, where he thought to himself, he asked himself the question, how can I know anything absolutely for certain? How can I absolutely know anything that is true? And for him, it's the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. That what he's saying there is that it doesn't matter, even if I'm in a dream right now, even if my understanding of mathematics is an illusion, even if we wouldn't use these terms, but even if I'm in a simulation, and the ultimate reality is a level above this, even if all those things are true, it cannot be wrong that I exist. That's Descartes' primary contribution. He thought that was absolutely stable, and from that he tried to build up multiple things, but he ended up distinguishing between the mind and the body. He actually only thought that he had proved the existence of the body after having proved the existence of God. So he begins with the mind. That's why he's considered a rationalist. He has his foundation of knowledge, the cogito, and from that he tries to prove God, and then from the existence of himself and God he tries to prove the existence of the external world and other people. So that's the beginning of the philosophy. We have to look here at Hume. So we get a lot of distinctions. We get Locke, we get Berkeley, we get Spinoza, we get Leibniz. But Hume is considered sort of he has this idea of radical skepticism, and it's, in a sense, it's the end of the Enlightenment project before Kant. Kant is a synthesis. There's a very clear progression of ideas from Descartes through the rationalist and empiricist branches, and then with Hume we get to a sort of dead end. An example of Hume begins by looking at how it is that we can trust the senses. So he gives an analogy of having 3 pots of water. So imagine you have 3 pots before you. On the left, a warm pot; on the right, a cold pot; and in the center, a room temperature pot. And you submerge your hands, left one in the cold pot, right one in the hot pot. Sorry, the other way around. Left one in the warm pot, right one in the cold pot. Get there until you're used to it, and you put your hands in the middle pot. To the hand that's been in the warm pot, the middle pot feels cold. To the hand that's been in the warm pot, in the cold pot it feels warm. So what he's saying there, the point being made by Hume in that situation, is that our senses can't tell us a reliable picture of reality, because if they did, then reality would have to be a contradiction, because one of our hands is telling us that this pot is cold and the other is telling us that it's warm. Those things can't possibly be true if reality is a consistent thing, and therefore the senses do not give us an accurate depiction of reality. We have to use the understanding. But also Hume criticizes the understanding, where he recognizes that when we make inferences about the future, these are never provable inferences. Okay, so we see that the sun rises every morning, but that just because we're used to associating the morning with the rising of the sun does not mean that next time we come to the end of the night that the sun should necessarily rise. It's merely an inference. There is no logical necessity. So what Kant does when he takes these foundations is he gives a distinction which is supposed to help us understand the problem. And this distinction is that between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. And now the phenomenal world is the world of experience, and the noumenal world is the world of actual external things which give rise to experience. So you might say that in Hume's pot analogy, the experience is of the temperature, is in the phenomenal world. In the phenomenal world, me putting my 2 hands in the pot, I feel it's cold on one and hot on the other. That's just a phenomenal world, and that world is allowed to contradict itself. For Kant, the world that is not allowed to contradict itself is the noumenal world, which is the actual objective temperature of the water in that pot. So that obviously doesn't resolve the problem, it just gives us a clarification between appearance and reality. But what he's doing here, Kant, is he comes up with a notion of a priori objective knowledge. So before Kant, you either had knowledge that exists in the mind and that requires no experience to make sense of, or knowledge gained from making observations about experiences and withdrawing that into the mind and create it. So we look at a whole bunch of things and then we draw knowledge away from that, or we look into our minds and we build knowledge out of it. So Kant creates this new category where we come to the world with what you could say is knowledge about the world. So we're born already knowing what's going to be in the world, which seems impossible. But really what it is that they are conditioning faculties. So what Kant does is he tries to say the idea of space is not something that could possibly happen. He seems convinced, now I don't think his arguments in this are necessarily rock solid, but he's convinced that if we imagine that space exists there is no possible way that we can account for space in theory without contradicting ourselves. So he says, okay, well, space can't be something that actually exists in the external world because reality can't contradict itself. But also, it can't be something that we come to in our heads without experience of the world. Because we don't have an experience of a world of space, then we can't understand the idea of space. So what he says is, space is one of the means by which we organize reality. It's a perceiving mechanism that takes in the noumenal world and creates out of it a phenomenal world. But that space is part of the world which we experience. So we construct what we consider to be the noumenal world out of these conditioning qualities. So essentially what happens there is that the objective stable reality that doesn't contradict itself becomes stripped of virtually any quality. But it's certainly a unique contribution, because what we're talking about with Kant is a lot of the things that we see in the world and which seem to be real are not in themselves actually things about reality. They are merely aspects of our consciousness which allow us to perceive reality. Okay, so that's I'll leave Kant there and I'll move on to Hegel. So you might say, from the end of that description of Kant, that the noumenal world has been stripped of space. It's also stripped of time and stripped of various other qualities too, because those qualities Kant believes can't make sense as being true of the objective world. The objective world almost seems pointless to consider. So that's kind of the starting point for Hegel, where the objective world, I don't know if he necessarily, you could say he rejects it, but it's certainly not something which we should consider. So he's trying to continue the Kantian approach, but he's focusing more on the phenomenological world. The phenomenal world. And his means of investigating the phenomenal world obviously would be some form of phenomenology. Now, Hegel takes this idea of the knowledge conditioning principle and he really runs with it. But he wants to connect it to social structure. So another important aspect of Hegel which he differs from Kant with is that the idea of the truth of the noumenal world that we would all possibly agree on existing is essentially defined by consensus, because we can't actually get out there to the noumenal world because we have all of these conditioning faculties. The best that we can do when it comes to assessing what is real is we can all contrast and compare our different assessments of the world, and if we find something that fits all of those, that can give a description, we can give a theory that accounts for all of those different perspectives without contradicting itself, that is the best thing that we can do in terms of understanding reality as it actually is. So if you see that, truth becomes synonymous with consensus. And since consensus, if the state equates to consensus so long as the state is in proper working order, it does make sense in a lot of ways that the state is sort of the greatest set of agreements. If you imagine people interacting on the individual level, one person with another, and they come to some form of agreement, and then elsewhere two people have the same form of agreement, and then in their separate communities they connect with other people and they find some greater theory of agreement. You can imagine that if that process is repeated over and over on the individual level, there's going to be consistencies. There's going to be like an ascending notion of truth through all of these different communities. And as they build and build and build and build, and the notion of truth is tested, it has to become, it's expanded to include all of the different communities that are becoming combined. Eventually, there's a higher notion of truth which is true for all of the different communities, and that is instantiated in the state, because obviously the organization is going to depend on every individual person consenting in some way to the truth of what is being said by the state. So because truth is a consensus, and because the state is consensus, what we have then is the state is truth. Now, the state is truth. Hegel says something like on the lines of, the state is the idea of God as it manifests on the earth. So what we're having here is the relationship between the truth and the state is parallel to the relationship between God and Christ. Truth is a totality, and the state is its instantiation on the earth. So by resolving all of the different contradictions in the theories of reality, we manage to get to a state, and that of perfect, a state which is possessed of consensus about what truth is, and that is the ultimate manifestation of the best thing that we can call truth, or God. And you can see how that's a parallel to Christ, where Christ is synonymous with God, but also different and worldly and of the flesh, where the state is synonymous in Hegel's system with truth, but it's also worldly and of the flesh. It's a manifestation of wholeness in the form of flesh. So I think that Hegel was essentially trying to produce a new Christ, and that's why I called him in previous videos some kind of alchemist, where he's trying to fuse the whole with the instantiation of the whole. That's what Christ is. Christ is the Word made flesh, or God made flesh. So yeah, as I say, there's a parallel between Christ and the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, coalescing out of the prima materia. So there's this notion that it's separate but also identical, but there is a coalescing, there is a perfection and a purification that takes place. So there's so yeah, concluding with Hegel, the things that I want to mention are, first, that the process of history and the production through time of a consensus instantiated by the state is essentially an alchemical process, where we have a prima materia of history, of human nature, and it's progressing through stages towards some kind of magnum opus, which is the synthesis and expression of the ultimate truth, which parallels Christ. And it's important to recognize here that the alchemists, the opus, the magnum opus, the lapis, was essentially identical with Christ. And the second thing I wanted to say is that, just emphasize, the state in Hegel's system is equivalent to truth. And I think that's really relevant to the critical theory, postmodern situation we find ourselves in, because a lot of the theorizing assumes that the state, the consensus, it might require a consensus of people with special knowledge, but consensus and the state produced by that consensus is synonymous with objective truth. And you can take that idea, and if you're not extraordinarily careful with delimiting its influence, you end up in a situation where the state becomes the agent of truth, and it becomes very difficult to distinguish between propaganda and reality. And that's why it's important, I think, to add a little bit of Schopenhauer to our understanding of truth, and certainly at least Nietzsche and perhaps Jung, where it becomes more psychological. So there is this process of development, and truth is some kind of manifestation, purification. It is the lapis, in a sense. It's the sort of alchemical opus that we're all heading towards, that we're all trying to make, and that's what truth is. But it's not to be applied to the social sphere prematurely. It should be constrained onto the psychological level, if at all possible. And I see in the world right now, I think what we're happening is that the dream of the alchemists, or the Hegelian alchemists, is trying to manifest itself in the external world, And that's extraordinarily dangerous, because we see people who have tried to do this to themselves. Nietzsche certainly went crazy, and you could argue that that's just because of syphilis, but I think you could also quite easily argue that he was going crazy because he tried to perform this crazy alchemical process on himself. And certainly Jung went into a long period of psychosis by investigating these things. So it's to be constrained onto the psychological level, and I see that in the Frankfurt School and some of the postmodernists, it's this alchemical process is extended out into the social realm inappropriately. Maybe we can get there one day, but first of all, we better be very comfortable with it on a psychological level and learn to distinguish between the psychological level and the social level.